The young and the restless spoilers shock. No one in Genoa City had expected the storm surrounding Audra to gain such momentum, yet the turbulence around her life had become impossible to ignore. Rumors had turned into allegations, allegations into investigations, and whispers into cruel confrontations. She had once navigated the corridors of power with steel in her spine and a smile that could bend walls, but now she was unraveling under the pressure. The same offices that once welcomed her now shut their doors. The same men who once leaned and now leaned away. She was growing weaker not from guilt, but from the suffocating isolation that came from being abandoned at the most fragile moment of her life. She was tired, not simply exhausted, but deeply worn from defending herself against people who had already made up their minds. She didn't need sympathy, she needed a shield. And the only person who had ever stood between her and the world was gone. Tucker had vanished, disappeared from Genoa City like a shadow at dawn, and with him had gone the only shred of support she had left. But distance could not silence conscience. When Tucker heard of the chaos raining down on Audra, when he saw her name splashed across headlines, smeared in backroom conversations, and dismissed by men who had once courted her allegiance, something within him broke. He had always lived by his own rules, navigating power games with the detachment of someone who understood every trick in the book, but he had never imagined she would become collateral damage in a war she didn't even start. The news cut deep, not because he believed she was innocent in every way, but because he knew she was never the villain they painted her to be. They wanted her gone, erased, stripped of dignity, and it didn't sit right with him. He hadn't meant to get involved again. He had made peace with the idea of letting Genoa City burn without his intervention. But not this. Not her. Not when she was being hunted by people with more secrets than morality. So he made the call. Victor had been in the middle of a quiet afternoon at the ranch, sipping his drink and reviewing a stack of documents related to recent business maneuverings, when his phone buzzed with a familiar number. The voice on the other end had changed, aged slightly, but it still carried that unmistakable weight. Tucker didn't waste time with pleasantries, but Victor, always poised and suspicious, gave him space to explain. Tucker didn't come bearing threats or bartering for business favors. He came with something far more dangerous, the truth. And Victor, whose life had been shaped by layers of hidden agendas and buried family ties, didn't know that he was about to hear a truth that would tilt the earth beneath his feet. Tucker told him to stop targeting Audra, told him to call off whatever quiet campaign was being mounted against her, because the reality was far more complicated than Victor could imagine. Victor asked why protect her, why defend someone who had betrayed the very people she claimed to work for? And Tucker, hesitant at first, revealed a secret that had festered in the shadows for decades. He told Victor that Audra wasn't just some strategist with ambition. She wasn't just another climber in stilettos who played both sides. She was, in truth, Victor's daughter. The words felt absurd, unthinkable, even to Victor himself. It had to be a lie, a miscalculation, some twisted attempt by Tucker to manipulate him. But Tucker didn't flinch. He didn't scream or beg or bargain. He simply stated the facts, one after the other, until the wall Victor had built around the past began to tremble. He reminded Victor of a woman from years ago, elegant, cunning, and heartbreakingly tragic. She had been Tucker's half-sister and Victor's secret lover. Their affair had been brief but real, buried beneath the politics of wealth and reputation. She had vanished not long after, refusing to speak of what happened between them, carrying her silence like a scar until her death. And she had raised a daughter alone, never telling the child who her father was. That daughter was Audra. Victor's mind reeled as the puzzle began to fit together in places he hadn't dared examine before. Her tenacity, her ruthlessness, even her occasional vulnerability, they were too familiar. How many times had he looked into her eyes and seen the faintest flicker of recognition without knowing why? But if what Tucker said was true, then everything changed. This wasn't about controlling Audra anymore. It wasn't about punishing her. It was about reckoning with a past he had tried to forget, and a daughter he had unknowingly turned into an enemy. For Tucker, speaking the truth was a gamble. He had never trusted Victor to act out of sentiment. But he hoped, perhaps irrationally, that revealing Audra's bloodline would at least stop the onslaught. He didn't expect redemption. He didn't even expect gratitude. He only wanted Audra to have a chance. Not just to survive, but to reclaim her place in a world that was systematically trying to erase her. And if Victor had even a sliver of humanity left, he would understand the weight of what had been stolen from her, a name, a legacy, and a father. Victor didn't speak for a long time. He hung up eventually, without making promises, but the silence that followed was louder than any declaration. And Tucker, watching the sun fall beneath the cliffs of wherever he had hidden himself, knew that the match had been lit. What Victor would do with the information was anyone's guess. But the truth was no longer buried. And Genoa City was never safe once a secret that dangerous began to breathe. Meanwhile, Audra remained unaware of the storm brewing behind closed doors. She sat alone in her apartment, phone silent, walls closing in, wondering if the world had truly turned against her. She replayed her past moves in her head, trying to decipher when everything had shifted, when the ground had been pulled from under her heels. She didn't know that the man who had once dismissed her as a threat was now staring at a photo of her with a mixture of disbelief and guilt. She didn't know that Tucker had gone all in to protect her, sacrificing his own safety for a truth too heavy to carry alone. And she certainly didn't know that her identity, her very place in the tangled tapestry of Genoa City, had just been rewritten. As Victor returned to his study, his expression unreadable, Nikki asked if something was wrong. He didn't answer. He simply walked to the cabinet, poured a glass of scotch, and stared at the fire for a very long time. Somewhere in the back of his mind, pieces of his memory began to stir. Fragments of a love he had forgotten, or chosen to forget, and the face of a woman who had once told him she would take his secrets to the grave. He had believed her. But graves were never permanent in this town. Not for the living. Not for the dead. And certainly not for the truth. Elsewhere, the players who had once cheered for Audra's downfall were tightening their grip. Contracts were being pulled. Rumors continued to circulate. Files were being handed over to legal teams, and meetings were held behind closed doors about how to ensure she could never work in the industry again. But those plans were built on an assumption that Audra had no armor left. That she was defenseless. That the people who once protected her were gone. What they didn't know was that one phone call had shifted the ground beneath their schemes. And that the man at the top of the food chain might now have a reason to burn their entire house of cards to the ground. What came next would depend on Victor. He had the power to restore her, to shield her, or to disown her again in silence. But no matter what he chose, nothing would erase what Tucker had said. Nothing would undo the blood that tied them. And nothing would protect the others once Victor began to see them not as strategic allies, but as vultures circling his daughter. In Genoa City, legacies were built on secrets. But once revealed, those secrets didn't just haunt the living, they changed them. Audra had not planned to eavesdrop. She had only returned to the ranch to retrieve a few forgotten items, remnants of a brief and bitter alliance with Victor that had turned cold. But as she approached the study, voices stopped her in her tracks. Tucker's unmistakable cadence, laced with urgency and defiance, reached her ears first. She had not heard from him in so long she had begun to believe he had written her off like everyone else. And then came the bombshell, a name spoken with reverence and regret, her name, tied to the one man she hated most. She pressed her back against the wooden door, hands trembling, listening in horror as her life unraveled in reverse. Tucker's voice was steady, recounting the affair, the woman who bore her in silence, the timeline that matched too perfectly to ignore. Victor's shock was real, his denial crumbling with each remembered detail. There was no laughter, no mockery, no smug dismissal. Only disbelief. Only the sickening weight of truth. Audra's knees gave out and she collapsed quietly to the floor, her breath shallow, her mind spinning. She had fought so hard to define herself in this town, as a strategist, a survivor, someone who took what she wanted and never looked back. She had lied, betrayed, manipulated, but she had done it all with purpose. But now that purpose was slipping through her fingers like sand. What did it mean if Victor, the man who had tried to ruin her, who had pulled strings to isolate her, who had watched her squirm beneath pressure without blinking, was her father? What did it mean to belong to the very man whose world she had wanted to conquer? Tears streamed down her face in silence, not because she was weak, but because she felt something break. Not a bone, not a resolve, but the part of her that had always believed she was alone. Victor sat stunned on the other side of the door, unaware that the woman they were speaking of was only feet away, crumpled and crying. He turned the words over in his mind like glass, sharp and dangerous. He had nearly destroyed her. He had ordered people to watch her, dig into her life, find her vulnerabilities. He had wanted her gone, neutralized, removed from the chessboard. And now the board had flipped. The pawn was his own flesh and blood. The guilt settled into his chest like stone. But Victor was not a man who allowed emotion to cloud judgment for long. He needed proof. He needed facts. Feelings could wait. And so he rose from his chair, straightened his jacket, and made a quiet vow to uncover the truth, no matter what it revealed. It was only later that he stepped into the hallway and found her. Not in the way he had expected. Not poised and combative, not cloaked in her usual armor of ambition and self-preservation. But on the floor, raw and shattered, her eyes bloodshot and wide with disbelief. Their eyes met, and in that instant, the war between them collapsed. There were no accusations, no glares, no smirks. Just a man and a woman, staring at each other like strangers who had just discovered they shared a face in the same mirror. Victor took a step forward, unsure of what to say, but Audra flinched, retreating inward. She had always thought of herself as unbreakable, but nothing had prepared her for the idea that her greatest enemy could be her father. Her voice, when it came, was quiet but heavy with betrayal. She didn't need him to say it. She had heard everything. Victor, for all his dominance and power, had never looked more small. He whispered an apology. Not because it would fix things, but because it was all he could offer. He hadn't known. He hadn't understood. And now, staring at her, he saw all the signs he had ignored, her instinct for strategy, her unflinching ambition, her uncanny ability to see 10 moves ahead. She wasn't just like him, she was him. But as quickly as the connection sparked, reality cut in. There was still the matter of proof. DNA didn't lie. And before either of them could take a step toward reconciliation, before apologies could mean anything, they had to know for certain. Audra stood slowly, wiping her tears without shame. She agreed. If they were going to walk into a fire together, they needed to know it wasn't built on smoke. Victor promised to arrange the test immediately. He wasn't doing it to protect himself. He was doing it because he couldn't afford to make another mistake, not with her. If she turned out to be his daughter, then he had nearly destroyed his own child. And if she wasn't, then someone had lied on a scale that would burn everything down. Tucker, meanwhile, disappeared again after the call. He had said what needed to be said. He had passed the torch, and now it was up to them to carry it, or crush it. He watched from afar, knowing he had lit a fuse that could not be undone. But he believed, foolishly or not, that Audra would find her footing. She always had. As the days passed, anticipation turned into anxiety. The test was conducted quickly, efficiently, but the wait for the results dragged like an open wound. Audra walked the streets of Genoa City like a phantom, unsure of her place, unsure of her future. People whispered when she passed. Allies had grown scarce. But none of it mattered anymore. If the test came back positive, she would inherit more than a name. She would inherit an empire, and the enemies that came with it. Victor, in his own way, began preparing too. Not just for a possible daughter, but for a reckoning. If Audra was truly his child, then his failure to recognize her was more than personal, it was tragic. He had spent his life building walls to keep betrayal out, never realizing that the one thing he had shut out was a bond he might have needed most. When the envelope finally arrived, the tension in the room could have cracked glass. Victor opened it with steady hands, but his heart pounded like thunder. Audra sat opposite him, stoic now, no longer weeping, no longer vulnerable. She was armored once more, but this time, not against him. This time, against what the truth might cost. And there it was. Positive. Audra was his daughter. Neither of them spoke. There were no tears, no embraces, no forgiveness offered or asked for. There was only the truth, and with it, a silence so profound it echoed. They both knew the real battle was just beginning. Let me know if you want to continue this storyline, perhaps Victor publicly acknowledging Audra, Nikki's reaction, or what happens when Audra uses this truth to rise even higher in Genoa City's brutal game of power.